The blazing Texas sun cast long shadows across the dusty trading post, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. Ezra Caldwell stood at the edge of the wooden platform, weathered hands gripping a crumpled letter that had arrived 3 days ago. The paper had grown thin from being read countless times, its edges softened by sweat and worry. His brother Samuel had been missing for 6 months, and this letter from Sheriff Martinez in San Antonio was the first real lead he'd received. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Ezra couldn't know as he stood there was that his desperate search would lead him to make a decision that would change everything. For just $4, his last 4 silver dollars, he would purchase the freedom of 2 Comanche twin sisters who possessed knowledge that could lead him to his missing brother. This unlikely alliance would not only transform his life, but reshape the very fabric of the community around him. If you're enjoying this story, tell us where you're tuning in from. And make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've saved something extra special for you. The letter felt like lead in Ezra's pocket as he stared across the parched landscape. Sheriff Martinez had written that Samuel had vanished while driving a cattle herd north toward Kansas. The last confirmed sighting was at a watering hole 50 miles west, in territory known for Comanche raiding parties that moved like ghosts through the mesquite. Ezra's ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of hard-won land, but without Sam's. Laughter echoing from the bunkhouse, it felt as empty as a freshly dug grave. Every morning for the past 6 months, he'd saddled his horse at dawn and ridden out, searching creek beds and canyon walls, following tracks that led nowhere and clinging to hope that evaporated like morning dew under the merciless sun. Cattle grew thin without proper herding, fences sagged from neglect, and the silence in the evenings had become so complete it made his ears ring. Standing in the shade of the trading post's warped wooden awning, Ezra felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him like a yoke. He'd promised their dying mother he'd look after Sam, promised at their father's grave he'd keep the family together, but promises, he'd learned, could be as fragile as spring ice. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world," came a gravelly voice behind him. Ezra turned to see Jeremiah Hoskins, the trading post owner, emerging from the shadows of his store. The old man's face was carved with lines deeper than creek beds, and his eyes held the knowledge that came from witnessing too much suffering. "Maybe I am," Ezra replied, carefully folding the letter and slipping it into his vest pocket. "Have you heard anything about Comanche movements lately? Any word from the reservation?" Jeremiah spat into the dust, his expression darkening. "Heard plenty, none of it good." He gestured toward the interior of his store. "Got something inside might interest you, though, might not. Depends on how desperate you are." The word desperate hit Ezra like a physical blow because it was true. He was desperate. Desperate enough to mortgage his land. Desperate enough to ride alone into hostile territory. Desperate enough to make deals with the devil himself if it meant finding Sam alive. The interior of the trading post smelled of leather, tobacco, and something else, something wild and untamed that made the hair on Ezra's neck stand on end. Jeremiah led him past shelves lined with ammunition, bolts of cloth, and sacks of grain toward the back corner where shadows pooled like spilled ink. "Got these 2 in yesterday," Jeremiah said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Comanche girls, twins, can't be more than 16, 17 years old. Pretty as spring flowers, but wild as mountain cats." Ezra's stomach clenched. "What are you telling me, Jerry?" "I'm telling you they're for sale. $4 for the pair." The old man's eyes flickered with something that might have been shame. "Times are hard, Ezra. The government's cracking down on the tribes, and some folks are looking to make a quick dollar however they can." $4, Ezra repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. For two human beings. That's the world we live in, Jeremiah said with a shrug. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Ezra stepped deeper into the shadows, and that's when he saw them. Two young women sat on a rough wooden bench, their hands bound with rope, their dark eyes reflecting the lamplight like pools of midnight water. They were identical in every way, the same high cheekbones, the same proud set to their shoulders, the same defiant tilt to their chins despite their circumstances. But it was their eyes that stopped him cold. There was intelligence there, sharp and calculating, and something else, a flicker of recognition when they looked at him. Not recognition of him personally, but recognition of his desperation, his need. They saw right through him. And in that moment, Ezra realized they knew exactly why he was here. The twin on the left spoke first, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her native tongue before switching to heavily accented English. You search for someone. It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with the certainty of someone who had seen many desperate men walk through that door. My brother, Ezra said, surprising himself with his honesty. He's been missing for 6 months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The twins exchanged a look that passed between them like lightning, quick, electric, and loaded with meaning. The second twin leaned forward slightly, her bound hands resting on her knees. We know many things, she said, her English more precise than her sister's. We know the movement of the herds, the paths of the warriors, the places where white men go to die. Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. What are you saying? We are saying, the first twin continued, that $4 is very little for what we know. But perhaps it is enough for what you need. Jeremiah cleared his throat nervously. Now hold on there, girls. I didn't say nothing about. You didn't have to, the second twin interrupted, her gaze never leaving Ezra's face. This man bleeds from a wound that will not heal. We can smell it on him like smoke from a dying fire. The trading post fell silent except for the distant sounds of horses and men going about their business outside. Ezra felt as though he were standing at the edge of a precipice, and the ground beneath his feet was beginning to crumble. How do I know you're telling the truth? He asked. The twins smiled simultaneously, and there was something both beautiful and terrible in that expression. The first twin spoke again, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Your brother, he has a scar here. She gestured to her left temple with her bound hands. From when he fell from a horse as a child. He laughs too loud and trusts too easily. He carries a silver watch that belonged to your father, and he sings when he thinks no one is listening. Ezra's blood turned to ice water. Everything she'd sighed was true, down to the smallest detail. No one but family could know about the scar, about the watch, about Sam's habit of singing old hymns while he worked. Where is he? The words came out as a croak. Not here, the second twin said. Not close, but not beyond reach for a man willing to pay the right price. Jeremiah stepped forward, his face flushed with excitement and greed. $4, Ezra, that's all I'm asking. $4 and they're yours to do with as you please. The moral weight of what he was contemplating crashed over Ezra like a wave. He was talking about buying two human beings, two young women who had been torn from their families and their lives. Every decent instinct he possessed screamed at him to walk away, to find another way, to maintain some shred of his humanity. But then he thought of Sam's laughter, of the promise he'd made to their dying mother, of the empty bunkhouse and the silence that had become his constant companion. He thought of 6 months of searching, of leads that went nowhere, of hope that had slowly withered like flowers in drought. If I pay the money, he said slowly, what happens then? The twins exchanged another of those lightning-quick looks. The first twin leaned back against the wall, her expression unreadable. Then you learn whether $4 can buy you a brother, she said, or whether it can only buy you 2 more. Graves to dig. The threat was delivered so matter-of-factly, so calmly that it took Ezra a moment to process it. These weren't broken victims cowering in fear. These were warriors, bound but not defeated, calculating their next move with the patience of hunters. I need to know more, Ezra said. I need to know you're not just telling me what I want to hear. The second twin tilted her head slightly, studying him with those dark, penetrating eyes. Your brother's horse was a bay mare with white markings on her front legs. She had a habit of shying in the shadows. He called her Belle. Another detail. No stranger could know. Ezra's hands began to shake slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch containing his remaining money. The weight of it seemed enormous, as if those few coins contained not just his last hope, but his soul. What are your names? He asked. I am Ayana, the first twin said. This is Kiona. We are daughters of Red Hawk, who was killed defending our village from your soldiers. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He thought of Sam possibly, dead or dying somewhere in the wilderness, and of these 2 young women whose father had been killed by men who looked like him, spoke like him, prayed to the same God he did. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. Kiona's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Sorrow is like rain, she said. It falls on everyone, but some ground is too hard to let it sink in. Jeremiah was growing impatient, shifting his weight from foot to foot and glancing nervously toward the door. So what's it going to be, Ezra? $4 and they're yours, or you can walk away and keep wondering what happened to your brother for the rest of your life. Ezra closed his eyes and saw Sam's face, heard his voice calling out from somewhere in the darkness. When he opened them again, his decision was made. I'll take them, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. God help me. I'll take them. The coins clinked as they hit Jeremiah's palm, 4 silver dollars that felt like 30 pieces of silver. The old man grinned and pocketed the money quickly, as if afraid Ezra might change his mind. Pleasure doing business with you, he said, then turned and walked away, leaving Ezra alone with the twins and the weight of what he'd just done. Ayana looked up at him, her expression unreadable. You have bought us, she said. But you have not bought our loyalty. That must be earned. And if I can't earn it? Kiona smiled, and there was something sharp and dangerous in it. Then you will learn that $4 is a very small price to pay for a very large mistake. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Ezra stood there in the dim light of the trading post, facing 2 young women who might be his salvation or his doom, and realized that his real journey was just beginning. The ropes that bound their hands seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the invisible chains that now bound all 3 of them together, his need, their knowledge, and the ghost of his missing brother pulling them toward a horizon that promised either redemption or destruction. As he reached out to untie their bonds, Ezra whispered a prayer to a God who seemed very far away, asking for forgiveness for what he'd done and strength for what lay ahead. Because somewhere in the vast Texas wilderness Sam was waiting, and these 2 Comanche sisters were the only hope he had left of bringing his brother home. The die was cast. The price was paid. And now, as the last light of day faded into purple twilight, Ezra Caldwell prepared to follow 2 strangers into the unknown, carrying nothing but $4 worth of desperate hope and the terrible knowledge that some choices once made could never be undone. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm against the hardpan road as Ezra guided his team of horses away from the trading post. The twins sat in the back, no longer bound, but watchful as hawks, their dark eyes scanning the horizon with an intensity that made Ezra's shoulders tense. He'd cut their ropes the moment they'd stepped outside, expecting gratitude, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, they'd simply rubbed their wrists and climbed into the wagon without a word. Miles passed in silence, broken only by the jingle of harness and the occasional snort from the horses. Ezra found himself stealing glances at his passengers. Through the small window behind his seat, Ayanna sat with her back straight as a rifle barrel, while Kiona seemed to be reading the landscape like scripture, noting every rock formation and distant cloud of dust. "You got a name for your ranch?" Ayanna asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the afternoon heat. "Caldwell Ranch," Ezra replied, his hands tightening on the reins. "Been in my family for 15 years. Good land, good enough. Got water year-round. From Willow Creek. Decent grazing for about 800 head when the grass is right." Kiona leaned forward slightly. "How many men work for you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ezra felt heat creep up his neck because the answer revealed just how alone he'd become. Right now, none. Had to let them go when... He paused, unsure how much to reveal, when money got tight. The twins exchanged one of their silent conversations, a flicker of understanding passing between them faster than thought. Ezra caught it in his peripheral vision and felt a chill despite the blazing sun overhead. "So you are truly alone," Ayanna said. "It wasn't a question. For now. And you brought us to this empty place because you think we will tell you where to find your brother." Ezra pulled the horses to a stop and turned around fully to face them. The weight of their combined gaze felt like standing before a council of judges. "I brought you because slavery is wrong, and I couldn't leave you there." Kiona tilted her head, studying him with those penetrating dark eyes. "Many white men say slavery is wrong. Then they find reasons why their situation is different. This is different. How?" The simple question hung between them like a blade. Ezra searched for words that wouldn't sound like justification, wouldn't reveal the depth of his desperation, or the terrible arithmetic he'd done in his head. 2 lives against 1. $4 against a brother's death. "Because I'm hoping you'll choose to help me find Sam," he said finally. "Not because I own you, but because it's the right thing to do." Ayanna laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The right thing? Your people have taken our land, killed our fathers, scattered our tribes like leaves in the wind. Now you ask us to care about one missing white man. I'm asking you to care about justice. Whose justice?" Kiona's voice was sharp as flint. "Your brother may be lost, but our entire world has been destroyed. Which justice matters more?" Ezra felt something crack inside his chest, not from anger, but from recognition. These women had every right to hate him, every reason to let Sam rot wherever he was. The fact that they knew anything about his brother at all suggested connections to the very people who might have killed him. "You're right," he said quietly. "I got no right to ask anything of you. But I'm asking anyway, because sometimes wrong. People ask for right things, and sometimes that's the only chance anyone gets." The twins stared at him for a long moment. Then Ayanna spoke, her voice softer but no less intense. "Tell us about this brother. Not the scars or the watch we already described. Tell us who he is, inside his skin." Ezra looked out across the rolling landscape, seeing in his mind's eye a younger version of himself with Sam's easy smile and quick laugh. Sam's the kind of man who'd give you his last dollar if you needed it more than he did. He once spent 3 days nursing a wounded coyote back to health, even though it had been killing our chickens. Sighed. Every creature deserved a chance to choose whether to be good or bad. He paused, swallowing hard against the tightness in his throat. "When we were kids, I was always the serious one, the responsible one. Sam was the dreamer. He'd lie on his back in the grass and point out shapes in clouds, tell stories about where the wind came from. Mother used to say he had enough imagination for 3 people, and yet he chose to drive cattle," Kiona observed. "That is not a dreamer's work," Ayanna added. "No, it's not. But dreams don't pay for land or food or medicine when folks get sick." Ezra turned to face them fully, no longer caring if they saw the desperation in his eyes. Sam took that job because the ranch was failing and we needed the money. He said he'd come back with enough to hire hands and buy breeding stock to make the place profitable again. He didn't go because he wanted to. He went because I needed him to. And now he's missing because I wasn't strong enough to hold things together on my own. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither side was sure they wanted to cross. Finally, Ayanna spoke. In our tribe, when a warrior goes missing, the whole village searches. No one rests until he is found or until his bones are brought home for proper burial. We're not your tribe. No, she agreed. But you are also. Not like other white men we have known. Kiona shifted position, her gaze moving from Ezra to the horizon and back again. The men who took us from our village. They spoke of cattle drives. They spoke of the trail that runs north through Comanche territory. They spoke of raids and battles and men who disappeared into the grass like stones into deep water. Ezra's pulse quickened. What else did they say? That smart men avoid the old hunting grounds between here and the Red River. That stupid men leave their bones. They're to bleach in the sun. And Sam? Ayanna leaned forward, her expression grave. Your brother was neither smart nor stupid. He was unlucky. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. Was? You speak of him like he's already dead. We speak of him as he was when we last heard his name spoken, Kiona said carefully. 3 moons ago, around the fires of our cousin's band, they spoke of a white man who sang while he worked, who showed kindness to a Comanche child who wandered into his camp. Hope flared in Ezra's chest like a struck match. He's alive. He was alive then, Ayanna shrugged. Whether he lives now depends on many things. The weather, the raiders, the choices he has made since. Ezra felt the world tilt slightly, as if the wagon had hit an unexpected rut. For 6 months he'd feared the worst while hoping for the best. Now he had confirmation that Sam had been alive more recently than he dared believe, but also the crushing knowledge that anything could have happened in the intervening time. Where? He asked. Where was he when your cousin saw him? The twins looked at each other again, and Ezra saw something pass between them, a decision being weighed, a price being calculated. That information, Kiona said slowly, is worth more than $4. I don't have more money. We do not want money, Ayanna said. We want something else. Ezra waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. We want to go home, Kiona continued. Not to the reservation where they pen us like cattle, but to our true home. To the place where our father's bones rest, and our mother still weeps for daughters she believes are dead. I can't promise that. The army does not patrol every canyon and hidden valley, Ayanna interrupted. A man who knows the land, who has reason to avoid soldiers, could find a way. Ezra understood what they were proposing, a trade. Information about Sam's location in exchange for help getting them safely to their ancestral lands. It would mean traveling through hostile territory, evading military patrols, and risking arrest or worse if they were caught. If we do this, he said carefully, and we find Sam alive, what's to stop you from disappearing the moment you see your people again? Kiona smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached her eyes. Nothing. Just as nothing stops you from leaving us in the wilderness once we tell you where your brother was last seen. So we trust each other, Ayanna agreed, or we all die trying. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ezra looked out across the vast expanse of Texas landscape, dangerous, beautiful, and unforgiving in equal measure, and realized he was about to commit himself to a journey that could end in disaster for all of them. How far? He asked. To your brother's last known location, 5 days of hard riding. To our home after that, another 3 if we are careful and the spirits favor us. And if we're not careful, Ayana's expression grew serious. Then the buzzards will feast well this season. Ezra picked up the reins again, feeling their familiar weight in his hands. Behind him sat two young women who had every reason to hate him and his kind, who owed him nothing but were offering to risk their lives for a stranger's brother. It defied logic, challenged everything he thought he knew about justice and mercy and the complicated arithmetic of human suffering. "Why?" he asked without turning around. "Why are you willing to help me?" The wagon resumed its steady progress as Kiona answered, "Because you cut our ropes without being asked. Because you speak of your brother with love instead of ownership. Because sometimes the spirits put people in our path, not as enemies, but as tests of who we choose to become. And sometimes," Ayana added, "enemies become allies when they discover they are fighting the same darkness." As the Caldwell Ranch buildings appeared in the distance, a simple house, a barn, and a cluster of corrals that spoke of better days, Ezra found himself wondering if $4 had bought him salvation or damnation. The twins had given him hope. But hope was a dangerous thing in a country where men disappeared without trace, and the difference between life and death often came down to luck and the kindness of strangers. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and the twins climbed down without waiting for assistance. They stood in the dusty yard, taking in the weathered buildings and empty corrals with the same intense observation they'd shown the trail. "Your brother built this?" Ayana asked. "We built it together. Started with just the house and added the rest over the years." Kiona walked to the edge of the main corral, running her hand along the sun-bleached wood. "Good work, built to last. Sam always said, if you're going to do something, do it right the first time. Wise words." She turned back to face him. "We will need supplies for the journey. Food, ammunition, horses that can travel fast and far." Ezra nodded, already mentally cataloging what he had and what he'd need to acquire. "I can manage that. The question is, when do we leave?" The twins looked at each other, then at the darkening sky. "Tomorrow at first light," Ayana said. "The longer we wait, the colder the trail becomes. And there are others searching for your brother now, people who do not wish him to be found alive." The words sent ice through Ezra's veins. "What others?" "Questions for later," Kiona said firmly. "Tonight we plan, tomorrow we ride, and may whatever gods watch over fools and desperate men help us all." As the first stars appeared overhead, Ezra looked at his unlikely allies and realized that his solitary existence was about to change forever. Whether that change led to reunion or tragedy remained to be seen, but for the first time in 6 months, he wasn't facing the unknown alone. Dawn broke over the Caldwell Ranch like spilled honey, golden light pooling in the valleys between rolling hills. Ezra had been awake since before sunrise, moving through his morning routine with mechanical precision. Coffee first, black and strong enough to wake the dead. Then a walk around the property to check for storm damage or broken fences. Though with no cattle to contain, the exercise felt more like visiting graves than maintaining a working ranch. He found the twins already awake, sitting cross-legged beside the cold ashes of a fire they'd built near the barn. They hadn't slept. In the house he'd offered, pointing to the spare room that had once belonged to Sam, Ayana had simply shaken her head and said something in their native tongue that sounded like flowing water over stones. "Your hospitality is noted," Kiona had translated. "But we sleep under stars that remember our names." Now watching them in the early morning light, Ezra was struck by how completely they belonged to this landscape. They sat with the stillness of deer at a waterhole, alert but unhurried, reading the wind and the behavior of distant birds with the fluency of people who'd learned survival from the ground up. "Coffee?" he offered, holding up a dented tin pot. Ayana wrinkled her nose. "Your coffee smells like burned bark." "Tastes worse than it smells," Ezra admitted. "But it'll keep you awake in the saddle." Kiona rose gracefully, brushing dust. from her borrowed clothes. Ezra had given them clothing from Sam's trunk, work shirts and sturdy pants, that hung loose on their slender frames but would serve better than their torn dresses for hard riding. "We need to discuss the route," she said, "and the dangers we will face." Ezra led them to the house where he'd spread a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table. The paper was yellowed with age and marked with notations in different hands, his father's careful script, his own rougher additions, and Sam's optimistic notes about potential grazing areas and water sources. "This is where we are," he said, pointing to a spot marked Caldwell Ranch in faded ink. "And this is the general area where Sam was headed with the herd." His finger traced a line northward toward the Red River. Ayanna leaned over the map, her dark hair falling across her shoulder as she studied the markings. "Your map is incomplete. It shows the white man's roads and the white man's towns, but not the places where we must go." "Such as?" Kiona joined her sister at the table, their heads bent together over the paper. "Hidden canyons where water runs year-round. Caves where warriors have stored supplies for generations. Paths through the Badlands that soldiers do not know exist." She placed her finger on an unmarked area between two mountain ranges. "Here, this is where your brother was last seen, but it is not marked on your map because white men think it is empty wasteland." "What's actually there?" "Sacred ground," Ayanna said quietly. "A place where our people have gone for vision quests since before memory. Your brother was there not by choice, but because he was running from something." Ezra's blood chilled. "Running from what?" The twins exchanged another of their wordless communications before Kiona answered. "From other white men. Men who wore the clothes of soldiers but moved like hunters. Men who asked questions about cattle and money and who might be traveling with valuable cargo. Outlaws? Worse than outlaws. These men had papers, badges, official authority to stop and search anyone they chose. But they used this authority for purposes the law did not intend. Understanding dawned like a cold sunrise. They were robbing the cattle drives, using their positions to find out which herds were carrying the most money, then hitting them. In territory where no one would ask questions." Ayanna nodded grimly. "Your brother discovered this. He saw them take another herd 2 days before they came for him. Instead of continuing north where they expected him to go, he drove his cattle into the sacred lands, thinking the terrain would protect him. Did it? For a while. But sacred ground does not stop bullets, and spiritual protection means nothing to men who have sold their souls for gold." Ezra sank into a chair, feeling the weight of revelation settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Sam hadn't just disappeared. He'd been hunted. The little brother who saw good in everyone, who nursed wounded coyotes and sang while he worked, had stumbled into a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial law enforcement. "The cattle," he said. "What happened to the herd?" "Scattered," Kiona replied. "Some driven off by the fighting, others taken by the corrupt officials. A few probably found their way to water and survived wild, but most," she shrugged, "buzzard food. And Sam, that is what we must discover." Ezra studied the map again, noting the vast distances between settlements and the areas marked, with warnings about hostile Indians or dangerous terrain. "How long ago did your cousin's band see him in this sacred place?" 3 moons, as we said. But there are signs that he survived the initial attack and escaped deeper into the canyons. Whether he lived beyond that depends on his knowledge of the land and his ability to find food and water in a country that kills white men regularly. "You said these corrupt officials were still looking for him. Why? If they got the cattle, why hunt one man?" Ayanna's expression darkened. "Because your brother saw their faces. Because he knows their names. Because a man with such knowledge is either a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy, and they have not yet decided which." The implications hit Ezra like a physical blow. If Sam was alive, he was living as a fugitive, hiding from both hostile Indians and corrupt lawmen, probably. Wounded and certainly desperate. If he was dead, his killers wore badges and had the full authority of territorial law behind them. "We'll need more than supplies," Ezra said slowly. "We'll need to travel like ghosts. Stay off main trails, avoid settlements, trust no one in." "Uniform. Now you begin to understand," Kiona said approvingly. "This is not a rescue mission. This is a war party going into enemy territory." Ezra rose and walked to the window, looking out across the empty pastures where his cattle had once grazed. The land looked different now, not like home, but like the edge of a battlefield. "How do I know you're telling me the truth?" he asked without turning around. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate plan to get me killed and steal what little I have left?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. When he turned back to the twins, he found them watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. "You do not know," Ayala said simply. "Just as we do not know if you plan to turn us over to soldiers once we have served your purpose. Trust is a luxury none of us can afford, yet all of us must practice." Kiona moved to the fireplace where Sam's rifle hung on wooden pegs above the mantel. She lifted it down, checking the action with practiced efficiency. "This weapon is well maintained. Your brother cared for his tools." Sam always said a man's gear was a reflection of his character. Wise words. "We will need this rifle and others if you have them. The men we hunt are well armed and will not hesitate to kill anyone who threatens their operation." Ezra walked to a trunk in the corner and began pulling out supplies, ammunition, a second rifle, his father's old army pistol, dried food wrapped in oilcloth. As he worked, he found himself cataloging not just equipment, but memories. The pistol had been carried through the Mexican War. The rifles had put meat on the table through countless harsh winters. The camping gear had sheltered 3 generations of Caldwell men under stars that seemed indifferent to human suffering. "There's something else you need to know," he said without turning around. "I've never killed a man. Never even shot at one. If we run into these corrupt officials, I don't know if I'll be able to pull the trigger when the time comes." The twins were quiet for a long moment. Then Kiona spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Killing changes a person. It marks the soul in ways that never fully heal. But sometimes the choice is between becoming a killer and watching innocent people die. And if I can't make that choice, then we will make it for you," Ayana said. Matter-of-factly, "We have killed before in defense of our people and our land. We can kill again if necessary." The casual way she spoke of taking life should have frightened Ezra, but instead he felt a strange sense of relief. These women were not helpless victims grateful for rescue. They were warriors who'd chosen to ally with him for their own complex reasons, bringing skills and knowledge he lacked. "Why?" he asked. "Why risk your lives for my brother? You could disappear tonight, travel to your homeland on your own. Why tie your fate to mine?" Ayana walked to the map, tracing the route they would take with one slim finger. "Because your brother showed kindness to a Comanche child when he could have driven her away. Because he sang songs that our cousin's band recognized, songs of sorrow and hope that cross all boundaries of language and blood. And because," Kiona added, "a man who would mortgage his ranch and spend his last dollars to buy our freedom is not a man we can abandon to face this darkness alone." The admission hung between them like a bridge built of shared understanding. Ezra realized that somewhere in the space between the trading post and this kitchen table, they had stopped being strangers and become something else. Not quite friends, not yet family, but people bound by common purpose and mutual need. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling a small leather journal from the trunk. Sam kept records of everything. The people he met, the places he camped, the problems he encountered. He was always scribbling in this book. If we find him, or if we find evidence of what happened to him, this might help us understand the larger picture. Kiona took the journal, flipping through pages covered with Sam's neat handwriting. Your brother was observant. He notes the movement of other herds, the behavior of local officials, the presence of military patrols. This information could be valuable or dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands. Then we must ensure it does not. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning coolness and promising another day of blazing heat. Ezra looked at his companions, two young Comanche women who'd been slaves yesterday and were willing partners today, and marveled at how quickly circumstances could transform strangers into allies. We should leave within the hour, he said. Travel during the heat of the day when most sensible people are seeking shade. Make camp in the late afternoon and travel again after sunset. Agreed, but first there is something we must do. Ayanna walked outside, returning with a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing what looked like dried herbs, small bones, and stones worn smooth by water. We must ask the spirits for protection, she explained. And we must make an offering for your brother's safe return. Ezra watched as the twins arranged the items in a specific pattern on the floor, murmuring words in their native tongue. The ritual was foreign to him, invoking gods he didn't recognize and traditions that predated his family's arrival in Texas by centuries. Yet something about their reverence, their absolute faith in forces beyond human understanding, resonated with his own desperate prayers for Sam's safety. What should I do? He asked. Kiona looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting depths. He was only beginning to fathom. Think of your brother. Picture him alive and whole. Add your will to ours, and perhaps the spirits will hear. So Ezra knelt on the kitchen floor of his family's house, surrounded by sacred objects from a culture his people had tried to destroy, and prayed to whatever gods might be listening for the safe return of the only family he had left. It was a moment of profound surrender, acknowledging that some battles couldn't be won by strength or determination alone. When the ritual was complete, they packed the remaining supplies in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey ahead. The horses were saddled, the route confirmed, the weapons checked and loaded. Everything was ready, except for the question that haunted them all. Would they find Sam alive? Or would they simply be adding 3 more graves to the hostile territory that stretched endlessly toward the horizon? As they mounted their horses and turned toward the rising sun, Ezra took one last look at the ranch that had been his whole world until yesterday. It looked smaller already, like something viewed through the wrong end of a telescope, and he wondered if he would ever see it again. Behind him, Ayanna and Kiona sat their horses with the easy grace of people born to the saddle, their faces set toward distant mountains and the unknown fate of a man they'd never met, but had chosen to save. Ahead lay 5 days of hard riding through some of the most dangerous territory in Texas, pursued by corrupt officials and threatened by hostile tribes, who might not distinguish between good white men and bad ones. But for the first time since Sam had disappeared, Ezra wasn't riding alone. The trust between them was fragile as morning frost, built on necessity rather than affection, but it was real. And sometimes, in a world where brothers vanished without trace and justice wore a badge while committing crimes, fragile trust was the strongest foundation anyone could hope to build upon. 3 days into their journey, the landscape had transformed from rolling grassland into something altogether more menacing. Red stone mesas jutted from the earth like ancient fortresses, their shadows providing brief respite from the merciless sun. The horses picked their way carefully along narrow game trails that wound between boulders the size of houses, while overhead buzzards traced lazy circles against a sky the color of heated steel. Ezra's mare stumbled on loose shale, and he felt sweat trickle down his spine despite the cooling evening air. They'd been riding since before dawn, pushing hard to reach a water source the twins insisted would be safe for the night. But as the hours stretched on and the terrain grew more treacherous, Ezra found himself questioning every decision that had led him to this desolate place. How much farther? He called ahead to where Ayanna led the procession, her horse navigating the rocky path with sure-footed confidence. Not far. The spring lies just beyond that ridge. She pointed to a formation of red sandstone that looked no different from a dozen others they'd passed. Kiona, bringing up the rear, had been unusually quiet since noon, when they'd spotted dust clouds on the horizon behind them. She'd studied the distant signs through Ezra's field glasses before announcing grimly that they were being followed by at least 6 riders, possibly more. Could be anyone, Ezra had said, trying to convince himself as much as his companions. Ranchers, drifters, maybe even a legitimate patrol. Maybe, Kiona had replied, but her tone suggested she believed otherwise. Now as they crested the ridge and saw the promised spring below, a circle of green in an ocean of red stone, Ezra felt a mixture of relief and foreboding. Water meant they could rest and water the horses, but it also meant they'd be trapped. If their pursuers had been following their trail, the spring was everything Ayanna had promised. Clear water bubbled up from deep in the earth, creating a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees and patches of hardy grass. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock faces nearby, depicting hunters and animals and symbols whose meanings had been lost to time. "Sacred place," Ayanna murmured as she dismounted. "My grandmother's grandmother came here to seek visions before her first battle." Ezra led his horse to the water's edge, watching as the animal drank deeply. The twins moved with practiced efficiency, unsaddling their mounts and checking the animals for cuts or bruises from the day's hard travel. Everything about their movements spoke of people who'd lived their entire lives on the edge of survival. "We need to talk about what happens if those riders catch up to us," Ezra said as they made a cold camp in the shelter of the largest cottonwood. Kiona looked up from where she was examining their dwindling food supplies. "What happens is we find out whether you can kill when killing becomes necessary. There might be another way. Legitimate lawmen do not follow a trail for 3 days without identifying themselves," Ayanna interrupted. "These men hunt in secret because what they do cannot bear the light of day." Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "How can you be so certain?" "Because we have seen their kind before. They came to our village wearing badges and speaking of law and order. But they took our young women and killed our elders and burned our lodges while claiming to act in the name of justice." The bitter truth in her voice left no room for argument. Ezra realized he'd been clinging to the hope that the corruption the twins described was limited to a few bad men, not a systemic disease that infected entire territories. But the evidence was mounting that Sam had stumbled into something far worse than a simple robbery. "Tell me about the man who led them," he said. "The one who came to your village." Kiona's expression darkened. "His name is Captain Marcus Holloway. He commands a special detachment of territorial marshals supposedly, tasked with protecting cattle drives and maintaining order in the borderlands. But his real purpose is to steal what he was sent to protect." Tall man with gray hair and a scar across his left palm from an old knife wound. "He speaks softly and smiles often," Ayanna added, "but his eyes are like winter ice. He killed our father while apologizing for the necessity of it." The description sent ice through Ezra's veins because it matched perfectly with a man he'd met several times in the past year. Captain Holloway had visited the Caldwell ranch twice, once asking questions about cattle rustling in the area, and once inquiring about Sam's planned drive to Kansas. Ezra had been impressed by the man's professionalism and apparent concern for local ranchers' welfare. "I know him," Ezra said quietly. "He came to my ranch, asked about Sam's route, the size of the herd, how much money we expected to make from the sale." The twins exchanged one of their lightning-quick looks. "Then you understand," Kiona said. "This is not a rescue mission anymore. This is a hunt, and we are both the hunters and the hunted." Night fell like a dropped curtain, bringing with it a chorus of coyotes and the distant screech of hunting owls. They took turns keeping watch, two sleeping while one sat with a rifle across their knees, scanning the darkness for movement that didn't belong. During Ezra's second watch, around midnight, he heard it, the soft scrape of iron on stone. That meant shod horses picking their way carefully through the darkness. He woke the twins with gentle touches, and they responded instantly, coming fully alert without making a sound. Ayanna held up 3 fingers, then pointed toward the ridge they'd descended earlier. 3 riders approaching from the direction they'd come. Kiona gestured toward their horses, asking silently whether they should try to escape, but Ezra shook his head, pointing to the narrow trail leading out of the spring. They'd be sitting ducks on that path, visible against the lighter stone, and unable to maneuver if shooting started. Instead, they gathered their weapons and took positions among the rocks surrounding the pool. The petroglyphs seemed to watch them from the stone faces, ancient warriors presiding over a battle that would determine whether their descendants lived to see another dawn. The riders appeared as shadows against stars, 3 men moving with the careful precision of hunters who'd tracked prey to its lair. They paused at the rim of the spring basin, studying the layout below. Then one of them called out in a voice that carried across the still air, "Caldwell, we know you're down there. Come out peaceful, and nobody has to get hurt." Ezra recognized the voice immediately, Deputy Frank Morrison, one of Captain Holloway's men who'd been present during both visits to the ranch. A man he'd offered coffee to, shared news with, trusted because of the badge on his chest. "What do you want, Morrison?" Ezra called back. "Just to talk. Captain Holloway sent us to bring you back safely. Seems you've gotten yourself mixed up with some dangerous folks." Beside him, Ayanna made a soft sound of disgust. Even in the darkness, Ezra could feel her contempt for the lies being spoken. "The only dangerous folks I see are the ones following me with guns drawn in the middle of the night," Ezra replied. Morrison's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "Now that ain't neighborly, Ezra. We've come a long way to help you out of this mess. All we need is for you to turn over the Indian girls you bought, and we can all ride back to civilization like civilized folks." The casual way he spoke of the twins as property sent rage flaring in Ezra's chest. But before he could respond, Kiona's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "We are daughters of Red Hawk, and we do not belong to any white man. Come down and take us if you can, dog soldiers." The insult, calling them dog soldiers, the lowest form of warrior in Comanche culture, struck home. Morrison's voice lost its fake friendliness. "Have it your way then. Boys, spread out. We'll flush them out like quail from cover." Muzzle flashes lit up the rim of the basin as the 3 men opened fire, their bullets whining off stone and splashing into the pool. Ezra pressed himself deeper into the rocks, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, the moment when all his doubts about his ability to kill would be put to the test. A bullet struck the rock inches from his head, showering him with stinging fragments. He raised Sam's rifle, sighted on one of the muzzle flashes, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon bucked against his shoulder, and he heard a curse from above, suggesting his shot had at least come close. To his left, Ayanna's rifle spoke with deadly precision. A cry of pain echoed from the darkness, followed by the sound of a body hitting stone. "1 down, 2 to go. She shot me." Morrison's voice was high with pain and rage. "Kill them all. No prisoners." The gunfire intensified, forcing Ezra and the twins to keep their heads down as bullets ricocheted wildly around the basin. But the attackers had made a critical error. They'd silhouetted themselves against the stars, while their targets had the dark backdrop of the canyon walls for concealment. Kiona moved like a ghost among the rocks, working her way around the pool's edge to get a better angle on their attackers. Her rifle cracked twice in quick succession, and another voice cried out in the darkness. Then silence fell, broken only by the gentle splash of spring water and the distant call of a night bird. "Morrison," Ezra called, "are you still up there?" No answer. Minutes passed like hours as they waited, weapons ready, for any sign of movement from above. Finally, Ayanna rose from her position and began climbing the steep trail that led back up to the rim. She returned 20 minutes later, moving silently through the darkness to where Ezra and Kiona waited by the horses. 2 dead, 1 gone. She reported. Morrison escaped, but he is wounded and on foot. His horse threw him when my sister's bullet took him in the shoulder. Ezra felt a mixture of relief and horror wash over him. They'd survived, but the cost was becoming clear. 2 men were dead, and Morrison would undoubtedly report back to Captain Holloway that his quarry had teeth. "We need to move," Kiona said, already beginning to saddle her horse. "Morrison will ride double with someone or steal a horse from the nearest ranch. Either way, Holloway will know our location by tomorrow night. Where can we go if they've been tracking us this far? They know our general direction. We go where no white man can follow," Ayanna said grimly. "Into the heart of Comanche territory, where the spirits of our ancestors will either protect us or claim us." As they loaded their gear by starlight, Ezra found himself thinking about the 2 dead men on the rim above. He didn't know their names. Didn't know if they had families waiting for them somewhere. All he knew was that they died trying to capture or kill him and the twins, following orders from a man who wore the badge of law while breaking every principle justice stood for. "I never thought it would come to this," he said as they led their horses away from the spring. "Violence always comes," Kiona replied softly. "The only choice is whether you face it as a victim or a warrior." They rode through the remainder of the night, following paths invisible to Ezra but clear as highways to his companions. The twins moved with increasing confidence as they traveled deeper into their ancestral lands, reading signs and directions from stars and landmarks there people had used for generations. As dawn broke over a landscape of impossible beauty and terrible isolation, Ezra realized they'd crossed more than just geographical boundaries during the night. They'd entered a world where the rules he'd grown up with no longer applied, where survival depended on skills he didn't possess and alliances he was only beginning to understand. Behind them, somewhere in the growing light, Captain Holloway would be gathering his forces for a pursuit that wouldn't end until one side or the other was destroyed. Ahead lay the sacred canyons where Sam had last been seen, territory so remote and dangerous that even seasoned frontiersmen avoided it. And somewhere in that wilderness, if the spirits were kind and luck held, a brother waited for rescue by people who'd become family through shared violence and mutual trust forged in the crucible of desperate need. The hunt was no longer just about finding Sam. It had become a test of whether justice could survive in a world where those sworn to uphold it had become its greatest enemies. And the outcome would be decided not in courtrooms or legislative halls, but in the trackless wastes where only the strong and the clever lived to see another sunset. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the cool air and promising another day of punishing heat. But for the first time since leaving his ranch, Ezra felt something like hope stirring in his chest. He'd faced armed men and lived. He'd killed when killing became necessary. And he was no longer riding alone into the unknown. Whatever came next, they would face it together, a broken rancher, 2 Comanche warriors, and the ghost of a missing brother who'd somehow managed to bind their fates together in ways none of them could have foreseen. The canyon opened before them like a wound in the earth, its walls rising hundreds of feet on either side to frame a strip of burning sky. Ancient water had carved this passage through solid rock, leaving behind a labyrinth of side channels and hidden alcoves where shadows pooled like spilled ink. The horses' hooves echoed off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of human passage, hunters following game trails, warriors seeking vision quests, families fleeing the encroachment of an alien civilization. Ezra wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, tasting salt and dust. They'd been traveling for 6 hours since leaving the spring. following paths that seemed to exist more in the twins' memory than in any visible reality. The sun was directly overhead now, turning the canyon into a furnace that baked sound itself. Into silence. "We're close," Ayanna said, her voice carrying the weight of recognition and sorrow. "I can smell the sacred smoke from here." Ezra strained his senses but detected nothing beyond the mineral scent of heated stone and the occasional whiff of sage carried on vagrant breezes. Yet he'd learned to trust the twins' superior knowledge of this landscape, just as they'd learned to trust his determination to find Sam, regardless of the cost. The canyon floor began to show signs of recent disturbance, scattered bones that might have belonged to cattle, the remains of old campfires, and most disturbing of all, pieces of cloth and leather that spoke of human presence. Kiona dismounted to examine a scrap of blue fabric caught on a thorn bush, her expression growing grave as she held it up to the light. "This is not Comanche," she said. "White man's shirt, good quality, torn by thorns, not by weapons." Ezra's heart jumped. Could it be Sam's? Possible. "The color is right. You said he favored blue work shirts." She tucked the fabric into her saddlebag. "But we will know for certain soon enough." They rounded a bend in the canyon wall and saw smoke rising from ahead, not the thin wisp of a campfire, but the thick, oily black of something substantial burning. The smell hit them moments later, charred wood, burned leather, and underneath it all, the sweetly nauseating odor of death. "Stay here," Kiona commanded, but Ezra was already spurring his horse forward. The scene that greeted them around the next turn would be seared into Ezra's memory forever. A natural amphitheater opened in the canyon wall, perhaps 50 yards across, with a spring feeding a small stream that wandered toward the main channel. It should have been a place of peace and plenty. Instead, it looked like a battlefield from which the survivors had long since fled. 3 wagons sat at angles around the spring, their canvas covers reduced to smoldering rags. Dead oxen lay scattered between them, bloated and covered with flies. Personal belongings, clothes, cooking utensils, children's toys, were strewn across the sandy ground as if a giant hand had scattered them in rage. But it was the bodies that stopped Ezra's breath in his throat. Men, women, children, all lying where they'd fallen, some clutching weapons, others reaching toward loved ones they'd died trying to protect. The canyon walls echoed with the drone of countless flies and the occasional call of buzzards circling high overhead. "Immigrants," Ayanna said quietly, dismounting to examine the scene more closely. "Families heading west, caught here by someone who wanted more than their money." Ezra climbed down from his horse on unsteady legs, fighting the urge to vomit. He'd seen death before, animals mostly, and the occasional settler claimed by disease or accident, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic brutality displayed here. "How long ago?" he managed to ask. Kiona knelt beside one of the bodies, studying the state of decomposition with clinical detachment. 4 days, maybe 5. Recent enough that the killers might still be in the area. Who would do this? Even raiders don't usually kill children. "Men who cannot afford witnesses," Ayanna replied grimly. "Men who have abandoned all pretense of honor in pursuit of wealth." Ezra moved through the carnage, looking for any sign that Sam might have been here, might have tried to help these people. Near the largest wagon, he found what he was looking for: a man's bootprint in the dried mud beside the stream, larger than the others and showing the distinctive wear pattern of someone who spent most of his time in the saddle. "Sam was here," he said, pointing to the track. "This is his boot. I'd know that print anywhere." The twins approached, studying the ground with practiced eyes. They found more sign, additional boot prints, evidence that someone had moved through the camp after the killing stopped, and most importantly, tracks leading away from the massacre site toward the far end of the canyon. "Your brother came upon this scene after the attack," Kiona concluded. "He searched for survivors, found none, then continued deeper into the canyon. But he was not alone. She pointed to a second set of tracks paralleling Sam's, smaller and wearing moccasins instead of boots. Someone was with him. A Comanche, probably young from the size of the feet. Understanding dawned on Ezra like a cold sunrise. The child you mentioned, the one your cousin's band spoke of, the one Sam showed kindness to, it appears so. Your brother found a survivor and took responsibility for keeping the child alive. The revelation transformed everything. Sam wasn't just hiding from corrupt officials and hostile Indians. He was protecting a traumatized child in a country that offered no mercy to the weak or unprepared. Every day he remained missing was another day a young life hung in the balance. "We have to move faster," Ezra said, already heading back to his horse. "Wait." Ayana's sharp command stopped him. "Listen." In the distance, echoing off canyon walls, came the sound Ezra had been dreading. Horses moving at speed, the jingle of harness and weapons, the voices of men who rode with purpose. Their pursuers had found the canyon entrance. How many? Kiona asked, cocking her head to isolate individual sounds. 8, maybe 10. More than Morrison could have gathered on his own. Ayana's expression was grim. Holloway himself leads them. Now the sound of pursuit grew closer, funneling through the canyon's acoustic properties, until it seemed the riders were just around the last bend. Ezra looked desperately around the massacre site, searching for defensive positions among the burned wagons and scattered belongings. "No," Kiona said, reading his thoughts. "We cannot fight them here. Too many, too much open ground. We go deeper and find a place where the canyon narrows." They mounted quickly and pushed their horses toward the far end of the amphitheater, following Sam's trail as it led up a steep path carved into the canyon wall. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, men calling to each other, horses snorting with exertion, the scrape of iron shoes on stone. The path climbed steeply, switchbacking up the canyon wall toward what looked like another level of the complex geological formation. Ezra's horse labored in the thin air and blazing heat, foam flecking its muzzle as they gained altitude above the killing ground below. They reached a narrow ledge just as the first of their pursuers entered the amphitheater. Ezra risked a look back and saw Captain Holloway himself, recognizable even at distance by his gray hair and military bearing. The man sat on his horse, like someone accustomed to command, surveying the massacre site with the dispassionate interest of a general studying a battlefield. "He's not surprised by what he sees," Ezra muttered. "Because he knew this was here," Ayana replied. "This was his work, his way of tying up loose ends." They pushed onward, the path becoming treacherous as it wound through formations of wind-carved stone. The horses picked their way carefully, one misplaced step meaning a fatal fall to the rocks hundreds of feet below. Behind them, Holloway's men had found the trail and were beginning their own ascent. The path leveled out onto a broad shelf of stone that offered temporary concealment behind weathered boulders. Here, the twins called a halt to rest the horses and plan their next move. "The sacred caves are just ahead," Kiona said, pointing to what looked like a solid rock face. "But reaching them means crossing open ground where we will be visible to anyone below." Ezra studied the terrain, noting the scattered cover and the distances involved. "How far?" 200 yards, maybe less. "But the path is narrow and exposed. If they start shooting while we're crossing..." She didn't need to finish the thought. They'd be sitting ducks, silhouetted against the lighter stone with nowhere to take cover. "What about splitting up?" Ezra suggested. "You two make for the caves while I create a distraction." Both twins turned to stare at him with identical expressions of disbelief. "You would sacrifice yourself for people you barely know?" Ayana asked. "I'd buy time for you to escape and continue searching for Sam. Makes sense tactically." Kiona shook her head firmly. "Your tactics are flawed." Without us, you will never find your brother. Without you, we have no reason to search. We succeed together or fail together. The sound of horses on stone grew closer. Their pursuers had navigated the steepest part of the climb and would reach the shelf within minutes. Ezra felt the familiar, cold knot of fear in his stomach, but this time it was mixed with something else, a fierce protectiveness toward the two women who'd risked everything to help a stranger. Then we go together, he said, fast as we can across the open ground, and hope their horses are too tired for accurate shooting. They remounted and prepared for the dash across exposed stone. Behind them, voices echoed off the canyon walls as Holloway's men coordinated their pursuit. These weren't ordinary outlaws or corrupt officials acting alone. They moved with military precision, suggesting resources and organization that reached far beyond territorial law enforcement. Ready? Kiona asked, her hand resting on her rifle. Ezra nodded, gathering his reins and preparing to ask his exhausted horse for one more burst of speed. Everything depended on the next few minutes, whether they reached the sacred caves, whether Sam was still alive somewhere in this labyrinth of stone, whether any of them would live to see another sunset. For Sam, he said quietly. For family. Ayanna replied, using the English word, but investing it with meanings that transcended blood and culture. They spurred their horses forward, bursting from cover onto the exposed stone shelf at a full gallop. Behind them, shouts erupted as their pursuers spotted the movement. The crack of rifles echoed off canyon walls, bullets whining through the air around them and striking sparks from the stone beneath their horses' hooves. Ezra bent low over his horse's neck, feeling the animal's powerful muscles bunch and extend as they covered ground at desperate speed. To his left, the twins rode, like centaurs, becoming one with their mounts in a way that spoke of generations of horsemanship bred into their very bones. A bullet tugged at Ezra's hat brim. Another struck the ground directly in front of his horse, causing the animal to shy violently before recovering its stride. The opening to the sacred caves grew larger ahead, dark and welcoming as a mother's embrace. They reached the entrance as more shots rang out behind them, echoing and re-echoing until the canyon filled with thunder. But they were safe, at least temporarily, in the cool darkness of passages carved by water and sanctified by centuries of spiritual use. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from the entrance, Ezra saw that they weren't alone. Fresh ashes in a fire pit, recently used camping gear, and most telling of all, 2 sets of bedrolls arranged near a natural shelf in the cave wall. Sam, he breathed, recognizing his brother's distinctive saddle blanket spread beneath one of the sleeping areas. Kiona knelt beside the fire pit, stirring the ashes with a stick, still warm. They were here this morning, maybe earlier today. Which way did they go? Ayanna was already studying the cave floor for signs, her tracker's eye reading a story in scuffed dirt and disturbed pebbles. Deeper, there are passages that lead through the mountain to other canyons. Your brother and the child are traveling the old warrior paths. Outside, they could hear Holloway's men reaching the cave entrance, their voices echoing off stone as they debated whether to follow their quarry into the darkness. The sacred caves were a maze of interconnected passages, some of which led to other exits miles away, others ending in bottomless chasms or chambers where unwary explorers became lost forever. Light torches, came Holloway's voice, distorted by the cave acoustics, but unmistakably commanding. We go in after them. No one escapes. Ezra felt something shift inside his chest, not fear this time, but a cold, crystalline anger. These men had murdered innocent families, corrupted the institutions meant to protect people, and now they were desecrating sacred ground in pursuit of their crimes. This ends here, he said quietly. The twins looked at him, seeing something in his expression that hadn't been there before. The desperate rancher who'd bought their freedom with his last $4 was gone, replaced by someone harder, more Dangerous. What do you propose? Kiona asked. We make them pay for every step. These caves are your people's sacred ground. You know them better than anyone. We use that knowledge to even the odds. Ayanna smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was a predator's expression. Now you think like a warrior. As torchlight began to flicker at the cave entrance, and the sound of cautious footsteps echoed from the passages behind them, Ezra realized that somewhere in the journey from his empty ranch to this ancient sanctuary, he'd become someone new. Not just a man searching for his brother, but a guardian of something larger. Justice, family, the right of good people to live without fear of those who wore badges while committing evil. The transformation was complete. Whatever emerged from these caves when the shooting stopped would be tested by fire and proven by blood. And somewhere ahead in the darkness, Sam waited with a traumatized child, trusting that his older brother would find a way to bring them all home safely. The hunt was about to become something else entirely, a reckoning that would echo through these sacred passages long after the last gunshot faded into silence. The sacred caves breathed with their own rhythm, ancient air currents carrying whispers of ceremonies conducted in darkness for countless generations. Ezra followed the twins deeper into the mountain's heart, their torches casting dancing shadows on walls covered with paintings that seemed to move in the flickering light. Warriors on horseback pursued buffalo across stone canvases while spirit animals watched from crevices with eyes that reflected the flame. This way, Kiona whispered, leading them down a passage so narrow their shoulders brushed the walls. The main chamber lies ahead. If your brother sought sanctuary, he would go there. Behind them, Holloway's men had entered the cave system, their voices echoing through the tunnels as they split into smaller groups to search the maze of passages. The sound of their boots on stone carried strange acoustic properties here, seeming to come from all directions at once. How many entrances to this main chamber? Ezra asked, checking his rifle's action for the third time in as many minutes. 3 that I know of, Ayanna replied. But there may be others. These caves have been changing for thousands of years. Water opens new passages while earthquakes close others. They emerged into a vast natural cathedral, its ceiling lost in darkness above their heads. Ancient formations created pillars and alcoves throughout the space, while an underground stream carved a channel along the far wall before disappearing into another tunnel. The air here felt different, charged with spiritual energy that made the hair on Ezra's arms stand on end. And there, huddled beside a small fire in an alcove formed by massive flowstone formations, were 2 figures that made Ezra's heart nearly stop beating. Sam sat with his back against the stone wall, one arm in a makeshift sling, his face gaunt from weeks of inadequate food and constant vigilance. Beside him, curled up like a sleeping cat, was a Comanche girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dark hair was braided with careful precision, and someone had fashioned clothing for her from pieces of Sam's spare shirt and a blanket. Sam, Ezra breathed, the name barely audible in the vast space. But his brother's head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief and hope. For a moment, neither man moved, each afraid the other was a hallucination born of desperation and exhaustion. Then Sam was struggling to his feet, his good arm reaching out as if to touch proof of his brother's reality. Ezra, how in God's name did you? His words cut off as he saw the twins, his expression shifting from joy to protective wariness. Who are they? Friends, Ezra said simply, walking forward to embrace his brother with careful attention to the injured arm. They helped me find you. The reunion was interrupted by the sound of approaching boots and voices from multiple passages. Holloway's men had found the main chamber's entrances and were converging on their location. The little Comanche girl woke at the sound, pressing closer to Sam with the instinctive fear of someone who'd seen too much violence for her young years. How many men does Holloway have with him? Sam asked, his question directed at the twins rather than his brother. You know about Holloway? Ayanna asked. Know about him? I've been running from him for 6 weeks. He's the one who ordered the attack on my cattle drive, the one who's been hunting me ever since. Sam's face hardened. And he's the one who ordered the massacre of those immigrant families. You saw it happen? I came upon it just after the killing stopped. Found little Steriner here hiding under her mother's body, too scared to cry. He placed a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. Been taking care of her ever since, trying to find a way to get her back to her people without getting us both killed. Kiona knelt beside the child, speaking softly in their native language. The girl responded hesitantly at first, then with growing excitement as she recognized the familiar words and cadences of her own tongue. Whatever Kiona said brought tears to the child's eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. She says her family was traveling to meet her grandfather's band when the bad white men attacked, Kiona translated. She thought all her people were dead. Not dead, Ayanna assured the girl in English, then switched to Comanche for a rapid explanation. That made the child's face light up with hope. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, echoing from at least 2 different passages. Ezra quickly surveyed their position, noting the limited cover and multiple approaches their enemies could use. They were trapped in the center of the chamber with nowhere to retreat. How's your shooting arm? He asked Sam, stiff but functional. Why? Instead of answering, Ezra handed his brother the spare rifle he brought from the ranch. Because we're about to find out if 4 people can hold off 10 in a cave full of echoes. 4 people and whatever spirits call this place home, Ayanna corrected, taking position behind a natural stone formation. Our ancestors fought battles here. Their strength remains. Torchlight began to flicker from the eastern passage as the first group of Holloway's men approached the chamber entrance. Ezra counted at least 4 shadows moving through the tunnel. Their weapons ready and their movements coordinated like soldiers rather than ordinary lawmen. Caldwell. Holloway's voice boomed across the chamber, magnified by the acoustic properties until it seemed to come from the stone itself. I know you're in there. Send out the Indian girls and the child, and I'll let you and your brother ride away. Counter offer, Ezra called back. You and your men turn around and leave, and I won't shoot you for the murderer you are. Holloway's. Laughter echoed off the cave walls. You're outnumbered 3 to 1, son. Don't let pride get you killed. Pride's got nothing to do with it. This is about justice. Justice? The contempt in Holloway's voice was thick enough to taste. I am justice in this territory. I wear the badge. I carry the authority, and I decide who lives and dies. You're just a grieving rancher who got in over his head. More torchlight appeared from the western passage as a second group of men took position. Ezra realized they were being surrounded, with armed opponents at multiple entrances, and no way to escape except through passages that might or might not lead to other exits. What's the plan? Sam whispered, settling into position with his rifle trained on the eastern approach. Kill as many as we can and hope it's enough, Ezra replied grimly. That's not a plan. That's a prayer. Sometimes they're the same thing. The first shots came from the western passage, muzzle flashes lighting up the tunnel mouth as Holloway's men tried to pin them down with covering fire. Bullets whined off stone formations and splashed into the underground stream, the sound magnified into a thunder that filled the chamber. Kaona's rifle answered immediately, her shot so precise that one of the muzzle flashes went dark and stayed that way. A cry of pain echoed from the passage, followed by cursing and the sound of a body being dragged to safety. One down, she reported calmly. From the eastern entrance, more shots rang out as a second group tried to advance into the chamber. Sam's rifle cracked twice in quick succession, driving them back into the tunnel where the confined space worked against them. They can't all charge at once, Ayanna observed, firing carefully aimed shots at anything moved in the tunnel mouths. The passages are too narrow. They must come at us in small groups. Ezra began to see the tactical situation more clearly. While they were outnumbered, their position in the center of the chamber gave them clear fields of fire toward all the entrances. Holloway's men had superior numbers, but couldn't use them effectively in the confined spaces. "They'll try to rush us eventually," he said, reloading his rifle, "once they realize the bottleneck works against them." "Let them come," Sam said grimly. "I've got 6 weeks of anger stored up, and I'm looking forward to spending it." The gunfight settled into a deadly pattern, sporadic exchanges of fire as Holloway's men tried to advance and were driven back by accurate shooting from the chamber's center. The air grew thick with powder smoke and the acrid smell of burning. Torch fuel. Little Steriner huddled behind the largest stone formation, her eyes wide, but trusting as the adults around her fought to protect her life. Then everything changed. A new sound echoed from the northern passage, not boots or voices, but something that made the twins suddenly alert like hunting cats. A rhythmic chanting in the Comanche language, growing louder as it approached the chamber. "What is that?" Ezra asked. Ayana's face transformed with an expression of wonder and fierce joy. "Reinforcements." The chanting grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of many moccasined feet moving through the tunnels. Holloway's men must have heard it too, because their firing became more sporadic as confusion spread through their ranks. "Impossible," Holloway's voice carried across the chamber. "There are no Indians in this area. My scouts confirmed it." "Your scouts?" called a new voice from the northern passage. Speaking accented but clear English, see only what they expect to see. They do not see the spirits of this place or the warriors who guard the sacred ground. An elderly Comanche man emerged from the northern tunnel, followed by a dozen younger warriors painted for battle. They moved with the silent confidence of people who knew every stone and shadow of these caves, their weapons ready, but their manner suggesting this was their territory being invaded, not the other way around. Ezra recognized the tactical shift. Immediately, Holloway's men were now caught between two forces, the defenders in the chamber center and fresh warriors controlling at least one of the major passages. The numerical advantage had just evaporated. "Red Eagle!" Kiona called. "Out in recognition." "Uncle, how did you know to come?" "The spirits whispered of a battle in the sacred caves," the old man replied. "And a child of our blood who needed protection. We have been moving through the deep passages since before dawn." Holloway's voice cracked like a whip across the chamber. "I don't know who you people think you are, but I'm a federal marshal, with authority to arrest anyone interfering with official business." Red Eagle's laughter was like winter wind through bare trees. "Federal marshal in the sacred caves of my ancestors? Your authority ends where the spirits begin, badge wearer. And these spirits are very angry about the innocent blood you have spilled." The old warrior gestured, and his men began moving through the chamber with practiced coordination. They knew the cave system intimately, using passages and handholds, invisible to Ezra's eye, to position themselves for maximum tactical advantage. "Last chance, Caldwell," Holloway shouted, but his voice carried desperation now instead of confidence. "Send out my property, and we can all walk away from this." "Property?" Red Eagle's voice turned deadly quiet. "You speak of human beings as property in the presence of warriors whose fathers died fighting such thinking. I speak of criminals and stolen goods that belong to the territorial government. You speak of lies while standing on ground made sacred by the blood of my people. There will be no more talking." What followed was less a battle than an execution. Holloway's men, trained for fighting on open ground with conventional tactics, found themselves completely outmatched in the maze-like cave system. The Comanche warriors moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing through passages Holloway's men didn't know existed, striking with silent efficiency and vanishing before return fire could be organized. The gunfight lasted less than 10 minutes. When the last echoes faded, 5 of Holloway's men lay dead in the passages. 3 others had fled back toward the cave entrance, and Captain Marcus Holloway himself knelt in the chamber's center with Red Eagle's knife at his throat. "You wanted to arrest someone," the old warrior said conversationally. "Perhaps you should arrest yourself for the murder of innocents." Holloway's face was pale but defiant. "You're making a mistake, old man. I have connections, authority. Kill me, and the entire territorial government will come down on your people." "The territorial government," Red Eagle replied, "will be very interested to learn about a federal marshal who murders immigrant families and steals cattle drives, especially when presented with evidence by respected ranchers and surviving witnesses." He looked meaningfully at Sam, who still held his rifle trained on their captive. "I believe you have a story to tell about this man's crimes." Sam nodded grimly. 6 weeks worth of stories. Names, dates, locations, everything I've seen and heard while running from his corruption. Ezra felt something settle in his chest. Not quite peace, but the closest thing to it he'd experienced since Sam disappeared. The immediate danger was over. The corrupt official who terrorized the territory was captured, and his family was safe. But as he looked around the chamber at the mix of white ranchers and Comanche warriors, who'd somehow become allies in the cause of justice, he realized something fundamental had changed. The boundaries that had seemed so absolute before, between races, between enemies and friends, between his old life and whatever came next, had shifted in ways that could never be undone. Little Stariner ran to Red Eagle, speaking rapidly in her native tongue. The old man's weathered face softened as he listened. Then he looked toward the twins with something approaching reverence. "The child says these women saved her from the bad white men, that they helped bring her home to her people. Such courage honors the memory of Red Hawk." Ayanna and Kiona exchanged one of their silent communications. Then Ayanna spoke. "We did what the spirits required." "Nothing more." "Nothing more?" Red Eagle smiled. "You turned enemies into allies, brought justice to the guilty, and reunited families separated by violence. If this is nothing more, then you have learned wisdom that many warriors seek their entire lives without finding." As the echoes of gunfire faded and torch smoke cleared from the ancient chamber, Ezra realized that their desperate journey had become something larger than a simple rescue mission. It had become a test of whether justice could survive in a world where those sworn to uphold it had become its greatest enemies. And somehow, against all odds, justice had won. The sacred caves that had witnessed centuries of human struggle had added another chapter to their history. The day when a desperate rancher, 2 freed slaves, and a band of Comanche warriors proved that courage and determination could overcome corruption and cruelty. No matter how powerful or well-connected the perpetrators might be, the hunt was over. But the real journey, learning to live in a world transformed by shared sacrifice and mutual trust, was just beginning. 3 months later, the morning sun painted the Caldwell Ranch in shades of gold and amber, its light catching the new additions that had transformed the property from a failing homestead into something resembling a small community. The expanded barn housed not just cattle, but also horses belonging to the Comanche families who had taken to visiting regularly. A second bunkhouse stood where Sam's old workshop had been, its walls echoing with voices speaking 3 different languages as people went about their morning chores. Ezra stood on the porch of the main house, a cup of coffee, much improved since Ayanna had taught him her grandmother's method of preparation, warming his hands against the crisp autumn air. The changes still amazed him sometimes. What had begun as a desperate quest to find his missing brother had evolved into something he never could have imagined. A working partnership between former enemies, united by shared experience and mutual respect. Sam emerged from the barn, his arm fully healed now, and his face bearing the healthy color of a man who'd put the worst of his ordeals behind him. He'd grown quieter since his ordeal, more thoughtful, but the easy humor that had always defined him was returning gradually. The nightmares came less frequently now, and when they did, he had people around him who understood what it meant to survive violence and loss. "Morning, brother," Sam called, walking toward the house with the measured pace of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary haste. "Kiona says the territorial marshal will be here before noon." Ezra nodded, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever they had to deal with official business. Marshal William Hayes was different from Captain Holloway. Honest, methodical, genuinely committed to justice rather than personal gain. But years of corruption had left deep scars on everyone's ability to trust authority. Any word on what he wants to discuss? Probably the testimony for Holloway's trial. "The federal prosecutors want to make sure our statements are consistent before they present the case to the grand jury." The legal proceedings had been moving slowly but steadily forward. Captain Holloway and his surviving accomplices faced charges ranging from murder to theft of federal property to conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, not just the testimony of Ezra, Sam, and the twins, but also detailed records Red Eagle's warriors had recovered from Holloway's camp, documenting years of systematic theft and violence. "Where are the twins this morning?" Ezra asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Down by Willow Creek with Steriner and her cousins. Ayana's teaching them to identify medicinal plants, and Keona's showing them how to read weather signs and cloud formations." The integration of little Steriner into ranch life had been one of the most natural things Ezra had ever witnessed. The child who'd survived unimaginable trauma had blossomed under the care of extended family, both blood relatives and chosen ones. Red Eagle had initially planned to take her back to the main band's winter camp, but Steriner herself had requested permission to stay at the ranch until spring, explaining in her careful English that she wanted to learn the white man's ways as well as her own people's traditions. "Knowledge is power," she'd said with the solemn wisdom of someone far older than her 8 years. "I will need both kinds of knowledge to help my people in the world that is coming." Her presence had changed everything. What might have remained? A temporary alliance of convenience had become something deeper when adults from 3 different cultures found themselves cooperating to raise a child who belonged to all of them and none of them exclusively. Ezra walked down toward the creek, following the sound of laughter and animated conversation. He found the group in a grove of cottonwoods, where Ayana knelt beside a patch of wild herbs while Steriner and 2 young Comanche boys examined each plant with intense concentration. Keona stood nearby, pointing out cloud formations and explaining how their shapes and movement predicted weather changes. "This one is good for fever," Steriner was saying in careful English, holding up a sprig of what looked like ordinary weeds to Ezra's untrained eye. "But you must pick it when the moon is right, or it loses its strength." "Very good," Ayana approved. "And what about this one?" The child studied the next plant carefully before answering. "For stomach sickness. But it is dangerous if you use too much. My grandmother said medicine and poison are often the same thing. The difference is in the amount and the knowledge of the user." Ezra marveled at the depth of traditional knowledge being passed down through such informal teaching moments. These weren't simple folk remedies, but sophisticated understanding of botanical chemistry, developed over generations of careful observation and experimentation. "Marshal Hayes will be here soon," he announced to the group. The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications before Keona responded. "We will be ready." The truth does not change no matter how many times officials ask us to repeat it. "Are you worried about testifying?" Ezra asked. Ayana considered the question seriously before shaking her head. "Worried? No, but cautious? Yes, we have learned that white man's justice can be unpredictable, even when the evidence is clear. This is different. Hayes is honest, and the federal prosecutors seem genuinely committed to seeing Holloway punished. Perhaps. But we have also learned that honest men can be overruled by dishonest ones, and that justice delayed often becomes justice denied." Her skepticism was understandable given everything they'd experienced, but Ezra felt cautiously optimistic about the legal proceedings. Too much evidence existed for Holloway to escape punishment, and too many powerful people had been embarrassed by the scope of his corruption to allow it to be swept under bureaucratic carpets. They walked back toward the ranch buildings as the sun climbed higher, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter. The cattle in the distance grazed peacefully, their numbers rebuilt through a combination of Ezra's careful management and unexpected partnerships with neighboring ranchers who'd been impressed by his role in exposing the corruption that had plagued the territory. "There's something else we need to discuss," Sam said as they approached the main house. "Red Eagle sent word that the Indian agent wants to meet with us next week." Ezra felt his shoulders tense. Official visits always brought complications, and Indian agents were notorious for their arbitrary enforcement of federal policies regarding tribal interactions with white settlers. "What does he want?" "To discuss the irregular arrangements at our ranch. Apparently someone reported that we're harboring Indians who should be on the reservation." "Harboring?" Kiona's voice carried dangerous undertones. "We are guests here, not prisoners hiding from lawful authority." "I know that, and you know that. But federal policy doesn't recognize the distinction. According to Washington, all Indians are supposed to be on designated reservations unless they have specific permits for temporary absences." The legal complexities were maddening. Steriner was technically a ward of the federal government, subject to policies designed by bureaucrats who'd never set foot in Indian territory. The twins had never been assigned to any reservation, having been captured and sold before official procedures could process them, but that legal ambiguity could be interpreted as making them fugitives from federal authority. "What did Red Eagle advise?" Ayanna asked. "That we prepare for a fight, but not the kind involving rifles and gunpowder. This battle will be fought with papers and precedents and political pressure." Ezra had been dreading this confrontation since the day they'd returned to the ranch. The informal arrangements that had evolved organically based on mutual respect, practical necessity, and genuine affection didn't fit neatly into the categories that governed official policy. Yet those arrangements had created something unprecedented, a working model of cooperation between cultures that had been at war for generations. "We'll face it together," he said finally. "Whatever comes, we'll handle it the same way we handled Holloway and his men." "With superior firepower and advantageous terrain?" Sam asked with a slight smile. "With truth, determination, and the knowledge that we're fighting for something worth preserving." Marshal Hayes arrived precisely at noon, accompanied by a clerk and 2 federal prosecutors from Santa Fe. They were professional, courteous, and methodical in their approach to documenting testimony. But Ezra sensed underlying tensions that suggested political pressures were building around the case. The defense attorneys are claiming that Captain Holloway was conducting legitimate law enforcement operations that were misunderstood by civilian witnesses, the lead prosecutor explained after they'd finished reviewing the written statements. "They're portraying him as a dedicated officer who may have used harsh methods but was acting within his authority to maintain order in a lawless territory." "Harsh methods?" Sam's voice carried barely controlled anger. "He murdered entire families, which we can prove through physical evidence and multiple witnesses. But his lawyers are arguing that those killings occurred during legitimate attempts to arrest known fugitives and recover stolen property." Ayanna leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "What stolen property?" "The immigrants he killed were traveling with their own possessions, heading west to start new lives. According to Holloway's records, they were transporting cattle branded with marks belonging to ranchers who reported them stolen. The defense claims the immigrants were part of a rustling operation and that Holloway's men were fired upon when they attempted to make arrests." Ezra felt his blood begin to boil. "Those records are forgeries. Holloway's men killed those people for their money and possessions, then created false documentation to justify the murders, which we believe as well." But proving it in court requires more than belief. It requires evidence that can't be disputed or explained away. The legal complexities were staggering. Holloway had been careful to create paper trails that supported his version of events, falsifying reports and manufacturing evidence with the skill of someone who'd had years to perfect his methods. Overturning that accumulated deception would require not just testimony, but also expert analysis of documents, handwriting, dates, and bureaucratic procedures. "What do you need from us?" Kiona asked. More detail about his methods, specific conversations, documented timeline of events. Anything that can help us prove pattern and intent rather than isolated incidents. They spent the afternoon going through everything again, this time with lawyers taking notes on legal implications and precedents. Steriner was called in to provide her account of the immigrant massacre, her small voice steady and clear as she described horrors no child should have witnessed. The prosecutors were gentle with her, recognizing both the legal value of her testimony and the trauma it represented. This child's account could be the key to the entire case, one of the lawyers confided to Ezra afterward. She's the only surviving witness to the immigrant massacre, and her description of the attackers matches Holloway's men perfectly. She's 8 years old. Will a jury believe her testimony over that of federal officers? If we present it properly, yes. Children are often seen as more credible witnesses because they have no reason to lie about what they saw. But Ezra worried about the psychological cost of forcing Steriner to relive her trauma in a courtroom full of strangers. The child had made remarkable progress in recovering from her ordeal, but legal proceedings had a way of reopening old wounds. "There's another issue we need to address," Marshal Hayes said as the afternoon session concluded. "The Indian agent's visit next week. I've been asked to provide an official assessment of the situation here." "And what will that assessment say?" Ezra asked. Hayes looked uncomfortable. "That depends on what I observe. Federal policy regarding Indian-white relations is clear, but enforcement has been inconsistent. Your arrangement here is unusual, and unusual arrangements tend to attract attention from Washington." "Unusual how?" "You're housing Indians who aren't on reservations, employing them in capacities that some officials might interpret as violations of federal oversight requirements, and allowing them to travel freely between tribal lands and settled areas. All of that falls into legal gray areas that make bureaucrats nervous." Kiona's expression hardened. "So we are criminals for choosing where we live and work. Not criminals, exactly, but potentially in violation of policies designed to maintain separation between Indian and white communities. Those policies," Ayanna said quietly, "were designed by people who profit from keeping us separated and powerless. Integration threatens the system that allows men like Holloway to prey on both our peoples." The observation was astute and troubling. The corruption they'd uncovered hadn't existed in isolation. It had thrived in an environment where artificial barriers between communities prevented cooperation and mutual protection. Holloway's men had been able to attack immigrant families and Comanche villages with equal impunity, because federal policies discouraged the kind of alliances that might have exposed their crimes. "What do you recommend?" Ezra asked. "Document everything. Show that your arrangements here are beneficial to all parties, that they contribute to peace and prosperity rather than undermining federal authority. Demonstrate that integration can work when it's based on mutual respect rather than exploitation." After the officials departed, the ranch felt strangely quiet. The legal and political challenges ahead seemed almost more daunting than the physical dangers they'd already survived. Fighting corrupt officials with guns was straightforward compared to battling entrenched bureaucracy with paperwork and procedure. That evening, they gathered around the enlarged dining table for a meal that had become their regular custom, a mix of traditional Comanche foods prepared by the twins and Steriner, combined with ranch fare cooked by Sam and Ezra. The conversations flowed between languages with translation and explanation, bridging gaps in understanding. "I have been thinking about what the lawyers said today," Stariner announced during a lull in the adult conversation. "About proving that good people did good things and bad people did bad things. What about it, sweetheart?" Sam asked. "Maybe the problem is that the law tries to make everything fit into boxes, but people are more complicated than boxes. You and Ezra are white, but you're not like Holloway. Ayanna and Kiona are Comanche, but they're not like the warriors who raid settlements. I am Comanche too, but I live here and speak English and learn white ways. Which box do I belong in?" The wisdom in her question silenced the table. This 8-year-old had identified the fundamental flaw in policies that attempted to govern human relationships through racial categories and artificial boundaries. "Maybe the answer," Ezra said slowly, "is that we don't belong in boxes at all. Maybe we belong wherever we choose to build families and communities based on something more important than the color of our skin or the language we grew up speaking." Spring brought new developments that tested their adaptability in unexpected ways. A group of German immigrants, having heard about the ranch through newspaper accounts, arrived seeking refuge from religious persecution in their homeland. Unlike previous visitors who'd come to observe and evaluate, these families came hoping to join permanently. "We have skills you might find useful," explained Johann Mueller, the group's leader. "Speaking careful English learned from a Lutheran minister. Blacksmithing, carpentry, brewing, cheesemaking. And we have children who need safety and education." The request forced them to confront questions they'd never fully resolved about the boundaries of their community. How many people could their arrangements accommodate before losing the intimacy that had made trust possible? How could they maintain cultural balance while adding new elements to their mix? "More families mean more complexity," Red Eagle observed during the council meeting called to discuss the request. "But they also mean more strength when troubles come. The question is whether these people seek to join our community or to change it into something else." The evaluation process took weeks, with the German families demonstrating their skills while learning about the cultural dynamics that made the ranch function. The children proved especially important, young people who played together without the racial prejudices their parents might have carried, creating bonds that transcended adult anxieties about cultural differences. "I think they should stay," Stariner announced after observing the German children for several days. "They laugh at the same things we laugh at, and they share their food without being asked. That means they have good hearts." Her endorsement carried surprising weight in the final discussions. The adults had been analyzing compatibility in terms of skills, resources, and cultural integration. But Stariner had identified the essential element, the capacity for genuine community, membership based on character rather than background. The German families were accepted with the understanding that they, like everyone else, would contribute according to their abilities while respecting the customs and relationships that had developed before their arrival. Their skills proved invaluable. Johann's blacksmithing expertise solved persistent problems with farm equipment, while his wife Anna's knowledge of food preservation techniques helped them prepare for the coming winter more efficiently than ever before. But the most significant contribution came from the children. The ranch now housed youngsters who spoke 4 different languages and came from 3 distinct cultural traditions, yet who played together, worked together, and learned from each other with the effortless adaptability of youth. They were living proof that racial and cultural differences need not be barriers to friendship and cooperation. That summer brought another milestone when Stariner turned 9, with a celebration that demonstrated how thoroughly their cultural integration had evolved. The party incorporated Comanche coming-of-age traditions, German folk customs, and American frontier celebrations, creating something entirely new yet respectful of all contributing elements. "This child represents our future," Ayanna said during the ceremony, speaking in English so everyone could understand. She carries the wisdom of her ancestors while learning the skills needed for the world that is coming. She is neither fully traditional nor fully modern, but something new and precious. Sterunner's response, delivered in confident English peppered with Comanche phrases and German words she'd learned from the Mueller children, captured the essence of what they'd achieved together. "I am Comanche because my blood remembers the old ways," she said. "I am American because this land is my home and these people are my family. I am myself because I choose to take the best from all worlds and make something good from it." Her words brought tears to many eyes and applause from all present. This was what integration looked like when it worked, not the erasure of differences, but the celebration of diversity within unity. As autumn returned and their second year as an extended family drew to a close, Ezra found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all together. The desperate rancher who'd paid $4 for 2 Comanche sisters had become the patriarch of a community that served as living proof of America's best possibilities. The ranch now supported over 30 people from 4 different cultural backgrounds, its prosperity built on the principle that diversity of knowledge and perspective created strength rather than weakness. Federal recognition had provided security, while preserving autonomy. Their success had inspired similar experiments in Colorado, New Mexico, and Kansas, creating the network of independent communities they'd envisioned. Most importantly, they were raising a generation of children who saw cooperation across racial lines not as an idealistic dream, but as everyday reality. Sterunner and her friends represented hope for a future where America might finally live up to its founding promises of equality and opportunity for all. The lonely rancher who'd paid $4 for 2 Comanche sisters had found much more than his missing brother. He'd found a future worth building, a community worth protecting, and a family worth any price the world might ask him to pay. But more than that, he'd helped plant seeds of change that would grow long after all of them were gone, proving that sometimes the most important investments are measured not in money, but in faith, courage, and the willingness to believe that people can be better than their circumstances suggest. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.